Did you know that over 100,000 people go missing every year in the US? But some cases, like Amy's, stand out as the most haunting and mysterious. Amy, a vibrant young woman, set out in the quiet of an ordinary evening, on what seemed like a routine night. She never returned home. Her car was found abandoned, the keys still in the ignition, and a blood-stained trail leading into the dark unknown. No one had seen or heard anything. Welcome to True Crime Theatre HQ. For more trending true crime stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that when it's released, you don't miss crime stories like this. And don't forget to share them with your friends. It was a quiet night on June 20th, 1996, when an off-duty ambulance crew driving along Interstate 476 stumbled upon something disturbing. What seemed like an ordinary evening quickly turned into the start of a mystery. At first glance, it might have seemed like someone simply stepped away for a moment, but this wasn't an ordinary situation. As the crew approached the car, the unsettling details began to unfold. A dark red pool of blood stained the pavement beneath the vehicle, seeping into the cracks of the road as if something, or someone, had been violently dragged away. The faint trail of blood droplets led them further into the night, a disturbing sign of a struggle that had already occurred. It wasn't just the abandoned car that stood out. It was the feeling in the air, the uneasy sense that something evil had taken place. The crew immediately radioed the police. This was no ordinary car accident, no simple case of an abandoned vehicle. Something terrible had happened here. The officers who arrived on the scene soon realized that the clues were far too specific to ignore. The blood, the tire tracks, the strange circumstances. Everything pointed to the fact that something evil-looking had just taken place, and they needed answers. The discovery of the body miles away from the abandoned Honda Civic sent a chill through the investigation, adding more layers to the growing mystery. The body was found in a desolate area, far removed from the scene of the car's strange abandonment. At first glance, the victim was completely unrecognizable. It wasn't just the bruising or the manner in which the body had been left. It was the complete lack of any identification or distinguishing features. The authorities were left to wonder, was this the same person whose blood stained the pavement near the Honda Civic? Was the body somehow connected to the discovery of the car with the engine still running, the door wide open, and no one in sight? It felt like too much of a coincidence. The officers had hoped for a simple explanation, some clear link between the car and the body that would give them a starting point. But there was nothing. No identification. No witness to explain how the victim had ended up miles away from the car. All they had were the cold, hard facts. A body with no name and a vehicle that belonged to someone who had simply disappeared. As the hours dragged on, it became clear to the investigators that this was no random act of violence. This wasn't just a case of an accident gone wrong. This was something much more dangerous, something with methodical intent. Whoever had been behind this, whoever had left the blood-soaked pavement and the abandoned car, was still out there. The killer was still free, and they had yet to reveal their identity. The local authorities were now facing an unsettling reality. A killer had taken a life, and no one knew who the victim was, what had happened to them, or why they had been left in such a remote, barren place. And perhaps most troubling of all, no one knew who was next. With each passing hour, the case grew colder. More questions piled up, but the answers seemed further away than ever. How had this person died? What connection did they have to the car, if any? What twisted series of events had led to their death? And why had the killer chosen to leave them in such an abandoned, isolated spot? The authorities could only guess at the motive, and the knowledge that a killer was still out there, still unidentified, loomed over every step of the investigation. the investigation into the strange discovery of the abandoned car and the body took an unexpected turn when the authorities identified the car's owner. Gail, a middle-aged woman with a quiet reputation in the community. But it wasn't Gail who was the key to unraveling the case. It was her daughter, Amy. The moment the police tracked down Gail, the panic began to set in. She was understandably distraught, but her confusion only deepened as the investigation revealed that her daughter, Amy, had been missing for several days. The police had believed the car's owner to be the victim, but the truth was far more complicated. Amy had been visiting town for summer break, spending time with her family before heading back to school. The town had been buzzing with the excitement of her return, but now, as the authorities dug deeper, it became clear that no one had seen her in days. The realization hit hard. Amy wasn't just missing. Something had happened to her, and it was tied to the terrifying events surrounding the car and the body. The police quickly contacted Gail, desperate to know if she had any answers. But she too was in the dark. The confusion over Amy's whereabouts only escalated the sense of urgency. Where was Amy? Why had she gone missing? Was she somehow connected to the grisly discovery of the body? As the investigation grew, the community's response became more intense. Desperate tips and reports began flooding in from all corners of town, with people claiming to have seen Amy in the days leading up to the discovery of the car. Some said they had spotted her at a local cafe, while others swore they'd seen her walking down the street late at night. But no one had concrete evidence, and nothing seemed to add up. The media frenzy began almost immediately. News outlets scrambled to cover the case, running stories about the missing woman and the blood-stained pavement. Speculation ran wild. Some wondered if Amy was the victim. Others feared the worst, with whispers of a serial killer or a violent crime spree haunting the small town. But no matter how many tips came in, no clear answers emerged. The public's concern for Amy only deepened as more questions piled on. Was she still alive? Has she been abducted? Or had something happened to her? As the investigation dragged on, it became painfully obvious that the answers were elusive, and the mystery was far from over. The more they searched, the more tangled the web became. Every clue seemed to lead to more questions, with each one shrouding the truth in even greater darkness. And as the days passed, Amy's family, the community, and the investigators were left wondering. Where was Amy, and who was responsible for the chaos that had shaken their quiet town? Amy had always been the kind of person who shined brightly, no matter where she went. Her achievements weren't limited to her athletic prowess, though her accomplishments on the field were nothing short of impressive. As a star athlete, Amy's name was well known at George Mason University, where she excelled not only in sports, but also in leadership roles. She was the kind of athlete who inspired others, pushing her teammates to reach their best, while maintaining an air of humility and kindness that made her well-liked by everyone. Raised in a family that valued hard work and perseverance, Amy always had big dreams. From a young age, she was driven by the idea of making a lasting impact in the world, not just through sports, but through education. Her passion for coaching and teaching was something she talked about often. While most of her peers saw sports as a means to an end, a way to get scholarships or attention, Amy saw it as a stepping stone towards something greater. She wanted to give back, to help others achieve the same level of success she had found, not just in sports, but in life. Her love for her family was another major pillar of her life. Her relationship with her mother, Gail, was incredibly strong. They shared a bond that went beyond just being parent and child. They were best friends. Gail had always been Amy's biggest supporter, attending every game, helping with homework, and always offering guidance as Amy navigated the complexities of growing up. Amy also had a close-knit group of friends who admired her determination, compassion, and unwavering dedication to her goals. No matter what challenges came her way, she always faced them head-on, never letting anything stand in the way of her ambitions. At George Mason, she was pursuing a degree in education, with the hopes of becoming a coach and eventually a teacher. It was clear to anyone who knew her that Amy had a calling in life. Her dream was to inspire young minds, just as her coaches had inspired her. Whether it was on the field or in the classroom, she was determined to make a difference. She wasn't just planning for her future, she was already shaping it with each decision she made. Her professors admired her commitment to her studies, while her coaches marveled at her ability to balance academics, athletics, and her personal life. She was the epitome of a well-rounded individual, a person who could excel in multiple areas without ever losing sight of what truly mattered. She worked hard to maintain her grades while dedicating countless hours to training and practice. It was never easy, but she thrived under pressure. She was the kind of student who would stay up late studying after a long practice session, determined to make the most of every opportunity. Amy's life was just beginning, and it seemed like there was nothing that could stop her. She had the world at her feet, the support of a loving family, and a clear vision of her future. But the dark cloud of uncertainty loomed over everything she had worked so hard for. As the investigation into her disappearance unfolded, the tragic reality began to set in. Her dreams and potential were suddenly cast into jeopardy, leaving those who knew her to wonder. Who would want to take away someone so full of promise? June 19th, 2022, started off just as any summer night in town. Warm, carefree, and filled with the promise of good times with friends. Amy had finished a grueling week of training and studying, trying to balance her athletic commitments and her academic pursuits. That evening, she met up with some of her friends at Smoky Joe's bar, a popular spot for students to unwind after a long week. It wasn't out of the ordinary for Amy to spend time with her friends at a local bar, especially after finals or the end of a sports season. She was, after all, a college student, a young woman looking for a moment of relaxation after the grind of schoolwork and practice. Amy wasn't one to go out every night, but this was one of those rare occasions when she decided to enjoy herself. The night at Smoky Joe's was supposed to be a celebration, nothing too wild, just a chance to laugh and catch up. Amy was enjoying herself, surrounded by familiar faces, her easy smile lighting up the room. Her friends recalled the night with a sense of normalcy, laughter, music, and the feeling of camaraderie that comes with spending time with people you trust. There was nothing to suggest that this would be the night when everything would change. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. Amy, ever the responsible one, didn't let herself get too carried away. She had an early morning practice the next day, and knowing how much she valued her training, she planned to leave the bar at a reasonable hour. Around 2:30 a.m., she said her goodbyes, gathered her things, and stepped out of the bar. Her friends watched her leave, not giving it a second thought. It was just Amy, always in motion, always busy, but never one to leave anything unfinished. She had a routine, and even a night out didn't seem to break her sense of responsibility. What happened next is a mystery that has haunted everyone who knew Amy. She walked out of Smoky Joe's into the warm night air and simply vanished. No one saw her leave the parking lot. No one saw her get into her car. Her phone records show that she had made no calls, sent no texts after she left. There was no evidence that she had encountered anyone on her way out. The sense of normalcy that had surrounded the evening quickly shifted into a deep sense of unease. Amy had been known for being careful, for always looking out for herself and her friends. She wasn't the type to wander off without telling someone, especially after leaving a public place like Smoky Joe's. The fact that she hadn't called her mom or a friend or even updated her social media as she usually did made everything feel off. It wasn't like Amy to simply disappear. The more people thought about it, the stranger it seemed. It didn't make sense. Amy was supposed to be going home, back to her apartment, or possibly stopping by a friend's house. She had plans for the next day. She wasn't the kind of person who would simply walk away, especially with her life so full of potential. Something had happened between the moment she left the bar and the discovery of her car, something that nobody could explain. The investigation began, but the answers were few and far between. There were no witnesses, no leads, and no trace of Amy anywhere. And as the days passed, the haunting question remained. What happened to Amy after she left Smoky Joe's? What turned a simple night out with friends into a terrifying mystery that would soon consume everyone who knew her? The authorities had no concrete leads, but one name kept emerging: Andrew. A man whose connection to the area seemed more than coincidental, but whose involvement in the case was anything but clear. Andrew was known in the community, albeit not in a way that would have suggested he had anything to do with a crime of this magnitude. He was an unremarkable figure on the surface, living in the same town as Amy, someone who frequented the same local spots. But as the investigation progressed, his name began to pop up in unexpected places. People mentioned seeing him in the area around the time Amy went missing, and some even remembered overhearing odd conversations where he seemed oddly fixated on certain details about Amy's life. But none of this was enough to connect him directly to her disappearance. What made Andrew particularly noteworthy was his strange obsession with firefighting. It wasn't just a hobby, it was an obsession. He spent hours talking about it, reading about it, and even attending local fire-related events and meetings. His life seemed to revolve around it, as if he was determined to become part of that world. But when questioned, his passion for firefighting wasn't enough to explain his behavior in the days leading up to Amy's disappearance. Investigators couldn't overlook the coincidence. Andrew had been in town at the time Amy vanished, and he had been known to frequent Smoky Joe's, where Amy had spent her last known moments. But despite these unsettling associations, there was nothing that could definitively tie Andrew to Amy's case. No fingerprints, no forensic evidence, no witnesses placing him at the scene where Amy's car was found. His obsession with firefighting seemed harmless, even if it gave investigators a strange sense of unease. Meanwhile, the community and the media continued to buzz with questions. Who was Andrew really? And what did he know about Amy's disappearance? The fact that his name kept surfacing made him an intriguing figure in the case. But without evidence, there was little the police could do. They could only watch, waiting for a break that never seemed to come. The deeper the investigation went, the more it felt like they were chasing shadows. Every lead seemed to lead nowhere, and Andrew, for all his strange quirks, remained an enigma. He was like a ghost, appearing in the right places at the right times, but never leaving a mark. As frustrating as it was for the authorities, the feeling of being stuck, unable to move forward, only added to the growing sense of dread that hung over the entire town. It wasn't until weeks later that the truth came to light, shattering all hope for Amy's safe return. The authorities had found her. But what they uncovered was far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. The medical examiner's report was a devastating blow. Amy's body was discovered miles away from where her car had been found, but the brutal details of her death sent shockwaves through the investigation. Amy had not died quietly. She hadn't disappeared without a fight. She had fought for her life in a way that no one could have anticipated. The signs of blunt force trauma were clear. She had been struck repeatedly, with brutal force. But it wasn't just the trauma that made this discovery so horrifying. It was what the medical examiner found next. Inside Amy's body, there was a tree branch, a foreign object that had been shoved inside her, violating her in the most horrific way imaginable. the discovery was a chilling testament to the savagery of what had happened to her. It was clear now that Amy had not just been a victim of a random crime. She had been brutalized, attacked, and left for dead in a cold and unforgiving place. The tree branch was a grotesque, undeniable piece of evidence that she had fought for her life until the very end. It was as if someone had tried to erase all traces of her humanity, leaving behind only a shell of what she had once been. The medical examiner's findings tied Amy directly to the scene where her body was found. The physical evidence confirmed that she had been assaulted and left to die in that remote area. It wasn't just her physical wounds that spoke of the violence she endured. It was the scene itself. The place where she was found was isolated, a quiet spot far from the hustle and bustle of town. It was as if whoever had done this to her had carefully chosen it, perfectly positioned for them to commit their crime and leave no witnesses behind. This discovery, more than anything, left the town in shock. It wasn't just a young woman who had been taken. It was the sense of security, the belief that something like this couldn't happen in their community, that was shattered. The investigation had taken a dark turn, and with it, the grim realization that the answers they were seeking would come at an unbearable cost. The tragic truth had been uncovered, but it was only the beginning of a deeper and darker journey. A search for justice, for closure, and for the answers that Amy's family and the community so desperately needed. The fight wasn't over yet, but the path ahead was filled with heartbreak and terror, each new discovery unraveling the cruel reality of what had happened to Amy. The investigation had entered a new and even more frustrating phase. For weeks, investigators had combed through the details of Amy's case, piecing together every shred of evidence they could find. But the true identity of her killer remained just out of reach. It was as if the murderer had vanished into thin air, leaving only fragments of a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. Amy's belongings had been recovered from the scene, and forensic experts had already begun analyzing the items. They hoped that something, anything, might yield a trace of the killer's DNA. It was then, buried in the forensic details, that the breakthrough came. DNA found on Amy's belongings matched an unknown male. It was enough to confirm that the killer had been close to her, that he had touched the items she had left behind. But it wasn't enough to identify him. The search for the killer had reached a point where everything seemed to be pointing in the right direction. Yet still, no answers came. The DNA evidence had confirmed that a man had been involved, but there was no match in the databases. No name, no face. Only a trail of genetic material that seemed to lead nowhere. The investigators were closer than ever, yet the murderer's identity remained just beyond their grasp. Frustration mounted as the team struggled to connect the dots. The evidence was mounting, but it still wasn't enough to make an arrest. The DNA, the interviews, all of it pointed toward a killer hiding in the shadows. Someone who had carefully covered their tracks, but left just enough behind to leave investigators hopeful, yet still empty-handed. With every clue uncovered, there was a sense that they were getting closer, closer to the truth, closer to the killer. But still, the final piece of the puzzle refused to fall into place. It was as if the killer had planned everything meticulously, covering his tracks just enough to stay one step ahead of the law. And with every new development, the investigation shifted focus once again, all the while haunted by the same question. It was a race against time, with each passing day leaving more questions than answers. Amy's story, once filled with hope, ambition, and the promise of a bright future, had tragically come to an abrupt and heart-wrenching end. A life full of promise snatched away in a violent and brutal way, leaving behind a community in shock and a family forever changed. Despite the immense pain, one truth remained. Amy's case wasn't just about her death. It was about finding justice for Amy and for every life her killer had stolen in the process. For the investigators, the search for Amy's killer remains an ongoing battle, one that has yet to reach its resolution. Despite the tire impressions, the DNA evidence, and the clues that have led them closer to the truth, the identity of the person responsible for this unspeakable act still remains a haunting mystery. The evidence points to a killer, but the face behind the crime remains unseen. There's hope that someone, somewhere, has a piece of information that can finally crack the case wide open. Whether it's a detail missed by investigators or a memory that someone has pushed aside, the community still holds on to the belief that the truth will come to light. For Amy's family, for her friends, and for the investigators who have worked tirelessly, the search isn't over. While Amy's case has been partially solved, with certain pieces of evidence providing clarity, the larger question of who committed this crime and why still lingers over the community like an open wound. The killer is still out there, and Amy's story cannot truly be put to rest until they are brought to justice. This case is far from closed. The answers are within reach, but only if someone with the right information steps forward. Amy's family deserves closure. Her community deserves peace. The investigation is ongoing, and the pursuit of justice will not stop until the truth is revealed. If this story moved you, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel for more true crime documentaries. And if you have a story of your own to share, or a thought on this one, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Your voice matters, and together we can ensure these stories are heard and remembered.